Okay, for the first time in Numbers and Narrative history, we have a second-time guest. So the first friend of the pod, Aidan, welcome back. For those who might have missed episode 1 and are obviously going to go listen to it after this, can you give a quick summary of who you are?
Aidan Parisian, a partner at Connor Group. I lead a team focused on data analytics, solving data problems for finance orgs and revenue orgs across size and shape.
We talked a lot about last time about how revenue orgs can use artificial intelligence. This time we focused on something a little bit different. So in classic Numbers and Narratives fashion, in the length of a tweet or a tweet thread, what do we talk about today?
We talked about the application of AI in finance, the adoption trends in finance, and the general adoption of AI across the board based on use cases.
And for anyone who did listen to number 1, you'll be pleased to know we did not talk about Syed a single time on this podcast.
Oh, man. And thanks so much, and everyone enjoy the episode.
I'm Ibby Syed.
I'm Sean Collins.
And this is Numbers and Narratives.
All right, and you're telling me about Connor Group and its structure.
So Connor Group, by and large, is focused on the office of the CFO. So we started in the IPO space. We started doing IPOs. Part of IPO, the IPO process is filing an S1, which is a lot of technical accounting. So we started to build out a technical accounting practice. Pretty soon we realized a lot of these companies wanting to go public didn't have the accounting structure they needed to actually be public. So then we got into financial operations to help them build out accounting. Pretty soon we realized a lot of them were implementing the same systems over and over, NetSuite, Coupa, or Workday. And so we built a systems practice. All of those are distributed applications. So then we had to build integrations a lot. So we built an integrations practice. And then the last piece we built is the part I run, which is looking at analytics as a whole. And so what's interesting is that's almost a pivot where we start with the outcome in mind and we look and say, what are you trying to report on? Well, we're backed by a PE firm. We have 15 new acquisitions in the last 24 months, and we have to get a consolidated ARR report. But we still have 5 CRM systems and 10 CROs. What do we do? A lot of that is data. A lot of that's process. And so AI has become part of that because the natural question folks have is, well, can I make this go faster, make this easier? And the answer is, it depends, which is always the consultant answer. But the answer is it depends because it depends on the problem we're trying to solve. And so it's been very interesting because we talk a lot about process, we talk a lot about data, and then we talk about AI, but AI and finance buyers are not enthusiastic adopters. They tend to be conservative. They tend to delay their purchases.
I was going to ask this exact question where, like, there's a lot of risk, right? Like the impact of doing things wrong is important, is interesting.
That's, as we were talking before we started, the office of the CFO tends to be the adult, and they tend to be the ones that are thinking about risk because they have to, because it's, as my former CEO used to say, the number one job of organizational leaders is to keep the organism alive, right? And the CFO's core to that. But yes, they tend to be cagey about risk. The numbers can't be wrong. They like to do a lot of diligence. They live in Excel spreadsheets. And so the hard part is as you come up with these cool, neat tools to do data work, they look at it and go, yeah, but I want to go back to doing VLOOKUPs and matches and pivots because that makes me feel comfortable. So we've done 2 surveys as a firm, and we have found roughly 75% of departments have a budget allocated for AI, yet only 20% have actually done anything with it. And that to me is indicative of the overarching demand from a board level, organization level. Let's reduce costs. Let's adopt AI. To the actuality of it, the pragmatic actuality of what do I actually do with it, right? I think we all thought ChatGPT and, natural language processing, LLMs, generative AI, we were like, oh, well, this is the beginning. More and more we're seeing that this is it, right? I mean, machine learning's been around for 25 years and is still a highly effective way to kind of see into the future. AI is really kind of machine learning on super steroids. The use cases, they don't align with problems that people need to solve, right? If you go back to outcome-driven innovation, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to solve for? The number one use case we see in finance organizations for modern AI is contract consumption. That's a big one, right? So you're trying to do revenue recognition. I've got 1,700 contracts in a year. The old ocular model required that everything came across in the same format because I always looked in the top left corner for data or bottom right. The nice thing about natural language processing is it can actually read the contract, understand the contract, and pull those terms out. Same thing with purchasing agreements, invoices. But outside of that, there's not a lot of really compelling use cases. Whereas Sean, you look at the sales space, there's a lot of use cases in the sales space, right? How am I gearing myself up? How am I consuming my GAR recordings? What's the customer sentiment and my feedback from customers or tickets or whatever else? Finance just doesn't see those same alignment.
I've got a thesis. I feel like one of the reasons for this might be the fact that like it's conventional software, right? So let's think back to like 50 years ago. And Sean, I think you know what I'm about to say here because I parrot this internally a lot. Sean hangs out at our office from time to time. And I like to shout about things. 50 years ago, companies like PwC and accounting firms would, hire hundreds upon hundreds of people to effectively like go down a ledger and like multiply everything by 20% to understand, by 0.2 to understand, hey, like how much are we gonna have to pay in tax? Really, it's like arithmetic. And then the computer came out and things where there is a logical X that goes into a box and comes out with a Y, you can now do 1 billion times faster with like 1/10 the number of people, 1/100th number of people in some cases. But there's this still sort of like fuzzy gray area stuff that actually requires a pretty low level of human thinking, but is just far away enough from objective input goes to objective output. So a great example of this is like identity resolution. So like Aidan P 123 Main Street with an ST, is that the same as Aidan P 123 Main Street with an STREET? A conventional like Boolean logic, think just like is equals in like Google Sheets or whatever, would say false. But a person would look at that and with very, very, very little like human intuition needed could say that that's like the same thing. That's the same person. It's just semantics. And I think what's interesting is the finance world does actually have like not that much of that like weird gray area work that requires like pretty little human thinking. Like it's either something that can be done by a machine, like it's something that you can use Excel for because like an input has a direct output, or it like needs like a human to do it because it like requires some sort of rational thinking versus like marketing. And
I think that's right. I do think though it's also that it's been broken for so long that nobody thinks of fixing it, right? I go back to when I was a sales leader, and at some point we were asked by finance, hey, can we figure out how many of the existing customers we have, what their payment terms are? Boy, that was a thankless exercise to go find that, right? And the number of organizations that don't have that sort of data at their fingertips would be shocking, probably, especially to a technologist, right? That's the funny part is technology folks are always like, but it's 2025. Why would you do it that way? Right. And so I think I think you're correct in that the majority, like the core work of an accounting or finance department is very much arithmetic. It's very much calculations, and that's kind of taken care of. That's where I think machine learning is actually a better use case for most finance orgs because they're looking at things like how do I cash forecast or how do I forecast sales, or right, you get into FP&A. That's an area that makes a lot of sense. But I do think when it comes to collecting unstructured data, those organizations, departments have been underserved for so long that they don't even think about solving for it. Is probably the right way to say it. And they also happen to be the owner of the budget. This is the other problem with finance departments is they tend to be the ones that own the spending, right? So they're the least likely to spend when everyone else is asking for money, right? Sean, revenue gets whatever they want, right? Because every dollar in revenue comes out as $2 on the other end. Finance,
come on, man, it's math. It's math. You like simple math, right?
That's straightforward. Finance doesn't prioritize themselves, right? They're almost like the parent, right? The kids are getting new clothes and mom's cruising around in 5-year-old shoes, right? It's kind of the finance makeup. But that's where we are seeing a lot of significant impact, is that ability to consume unstructured data. So go ahead, Chap.
The use case thing's interesting because I also think that part of the problem is the people who are trying to solve these problems through technology and build a product are not from the finance space. And so you look at it and you're like, okay, what's the problem I'm going to solve? Excel sucks. We've all been using Excel since the 90s. So I'm going to build a new spreadsheet. And it's like, that's not the pain point these guys have. They actually love Excel. They know all the shortcuts. They like, you have to pry that from their cold, dead hands. And so the hard part is like, for an entrepreneur or a software engineer looking at the finance space, who all they see is invoices and Excel, they're like, these are my two places to try and solve.
And if you think of it in a very cynical way, which, as we know, investors do, that's their job, there's not a huge TAM there, right? There's not a huge market. Like if you're looking at all the areas to serve, right? I have an idea. Let's build a piece of software and let's sell it to a group of people that are perfectly fine with a 25-year-old piece of software that still is wonky. Oh, and also don't like to spend money. Oh, that's a great idea. Let's go do that. Right? Nobody puts money in that, right? They want to put money in something that's got a 100x rocket to it, not something with a, hey, I think we could probably build a company and make a good $55 million a year. Like that's not pulling dollars in, especially not right now.
Here's the optimist's view, the opposite. You can build a product and you will still retain revenue for 30 years, even if you don't adapt it, right? Like if you can get acquisition, you are locked in.
They are finance buyers in general, once convinced a software works, are probably less likely. Again, I don't know. There's probably research on this, but I would bet you that they are less reactive to poor experiences than the average software consumer, right? Because again, they're change resistant, right? And once they trust something, I mean, when you sell software, my last company we sold to were finance buyers. So much of it is network effect, and so much of it is reputational and trust based. They need to know who you are and know you don't suck. No, you're not going to break something, right? And somebody else can come out and go, hey, we may make your numbers wrong, but we have all this really cool functionality. They don't care. They don't care. They care about the first part, not the second part, which is why Excel is still the #1 ERP on the planet.
We can pivot off this pithy one in a second, but I heard once that every software that is built, the #1 competitor that they don't think about is Excel or Google Sheets.
Yeah, even Data Rails is a company that built themselves basically on top of Excel because they just accepted the fact that accountants don't want to stop using Excel. And so they were like, what if we made Excel better?
I think the risk thing is actually like super, super interesting too. Because like, I don't know, I saw this job posting. It kind of went viral on LinkedIn. I don't know if it was a real job posting, but it was like one of those like founders that was like, I want to hire like 100x, like I want to hire 100x like finance leader who can use AI, so I don't have to like hire the rest of the finance organization. I think like people view finance, like I feel like you see a lot of this like with cost center like teams that like are that like they themselves like don't bring in revenue, right? Where it's like, I want to hire like 100x leader or whatever who can like use AI to like automate the entire job of a finance org. I'm like, brother, that is the last thing that you want to be able to do. Cause like, I'm just thinking about like an auditing firm coming in to like audit, like a finance or like an FP&A like sheet that.
And it's just tabbed in the corner with AI.
We're going to have the AI out of the AI. It'll be all good. Don't worry about it. It's the thing to think about. And this is always when I used to sell risk software at FastPath, is we used to jokingly say, you're selling the orange jumpsuit, right? You're selling the threat of something, right? And I think the problem is that while being wrong seems to not happen a lot, right? If we think objectively, well, accounting's easy. It always works. It's like a field goal kicker. You don't complain till they miss, right? And you take for granted the fact they hit, and you don't realize how much work goes into hitting over and over, right? As I think people tend to de-emphasize the importance of accounting because they forget how dedicated those people are. I mean, these are people who get physically uncomfortable if something doesn't tie up. That's a special type of person to be passionate about whether or not a number equals, right? And those people have been growing as a community for 200 years. And then, you get these fathers and sons, my parents were accountants. I'm an accountant, right? And so I think people like to dismiss that and say, oh, it's easy, so we should just automate it. Again, the cost of being wrong is pretty significant. That's the problem, is if your numbers are wrong and they're materially wrong, meaning that people have made investments in your business based on a number and that number was incorrect, that's a big deal. It's a big deal. As a founder, you take $100 million from a company based on data that you produce that shows your revenue, and your revenue is actually half of that. Do you think you get a second shot?
No, I don't think you get a second shot. I think you maybe like never get a job again, right?
You might have a lawsuit, right? It's depending on who your funding is. They could come at you with baseball bats in the middle of the night on the horse's head. But
That makes a ton of sense. I'm still the thing that you just said about a company that has 10 acquisitions and needs to like unify all the data from 10 different CRMs makes me literally like want to die. That sounds awful.
it's super common. One of the things that I've been struck by as I've been helping clients solve these problems is the lack, I don't want to say lack of care because that presumes intent. It's the lack of attention on data as a whole. It's the number of companies that haven't thought about it, and then they finally one day think about it, and the problem is huge. And the effort to solve it is huge. It's amazing how little attention it gets. It's akin to anything else in our lives that feels rudimentary or commonplace that we don't focus on.
It's attention and intention, right? Like, and I think one of the hardest parts about it is because you don't know where a business is going, how do you kind of pre-plan for what your data should be structured like and say like, okay, well, all our data that has anything to do with this needs to have these 5 parameters on it so that we can always connect these. Like that does, like I remember at Built, we had a Slack channel. So anyone who wanted to have a new event get logged for anything had to propose a name. We had a naming convention for it. We all argued back and forth about what the naming convention or what the name should be. What parameters are there? Are they required or not? What format are they? And like it took like 8 people to say yes before an event got approved. And I think that was important that we did that, but it took us 1.5 years, 2 years to get to that point. And we got to that point because we're like, wow, we have 5 events that all sound like they mean the same thing. It's tough to plan for it and it also would have been a lot easier to be like, screw it. We can solve this later and clean it up. Let the data team handle it.
It's not a burning platform. So take this back to the beginning about CFOs, functionally running businesses. One of the reflections that we share a lot is the biggest issue with data in an organization, especially as it scales, is that data is everybody's problem, which means it's nobody's problem, which means it's finance's problem because they're the only department in the organization who is required to be right again and again and again.
I mean, that was what we did at Peloton was we moved it from marketing into finance. Like all of data science, which was weird because like all of ML and stuff like technically rolled up to like my skip level was the CFO, which was super weird.
That was a good relationship, wasn't it? I mean, the funny thing with CFOs, especially good CFOs, is you're like, wow, you're a whole human being and you actually know a lot more than just accounting. You actually understand what we sell and how we sell it and why we sell it, and because they have to, they don't have a choice. They can't be wrong.
Differentiation and yeah, they're brilliant people.
Yeah. I think part of this, I don't know. I don't want to get like overtly political on this podcast, but like I think one sort of other thing that I see is like seems to be in like today's like funding environment a little bit less space allowed for like teams that are cost centers. I have a take on this, and I'm curious to see if you agree. Like the other day, me and my co-founder were walking around, and like my co-founder and I both have a data background, right? So like obviously we have a vested interest in selling into data teams at some point and like supporting people that care about data. Like that is like our core fundamental competency is like making structured sense of unstructured data. And one of the things that we were talking about is like there are a lot of teams that are cost centers, and a lot of the sort of the conversation that you see on the internet is like, oh, how do we like automate away cost centers? Like all these people that have like cost center jobs, like that don't like bring in revenue. Let's let them go. And one of the sort of theses that we had was, data people, especially those that don't have like an ML background, right? Let's separate like analysts out from like machine learning engineers. I think something that AI does do is allow them to use use the information that they have in like very, very creative ways to be able to then make their role into a revenue generating role, right? Like if you have an FP&A analyst and the FP&A analyst right now is like focused on reporting and they're like bringing all this information in and they're saying, oh, like, we have like, I don't know, I'm just going to make some stuff up right now. Like I have a consumer goods company and we sell sneakers, and, sneaker sales were bought by women at a 50% higher rate than like men, for example. I don't know. I'm like making all of this up. What you can start to do is if you have access to all of that information, the thing that's missing from today's like sort of AI landscape, the thing that like makes it so I think like the biggest weak point is like context about your business. And I think that context about business lies with people that do this sort of financial analysis. And if you can create something that allows them to take that information they have and flip it into something that can be used by other teams to actually drive revenue, that is like super, super powerful, right? Like you have this team that centralizes all the information. The data is all there. If you want to, I don't want to use the word weaponize because that has a negative connotation, but if you want to weaponize that into something that like leads growth, I actually think that you can see that sort of role hybridize a little bit, right? Where it starts to be, oh, we have all this information about what our customers buy. We know that like X demographic buys at this product at a much higher rate than X demographic. So here we're going to like let an LLM decide when it sees a customer, what email we send. And suddenly here's something that can go to the marketing org where here's an LLM that has context based that the finance team gives it. And the LLM can then go and like help the marketing team. Like there's like so many things like that where I think we're on the cusp of making it so these roles can be a little bit more advanced. I don't know.
I think you're right. But I do think there is an ever increasing demand for productivity out of every person in the organization, which I presume comes from investors, because but there's this pressure always, to your point, of like, well, what do they do for revenue? And we'll probably end up going down that path, because the reality is investors decide where money goes and they decide who runs the company. And so, it's that whole theory of like, well, a CEO should, not pollute a creek. No, actually a CEO's job is to maximize return for the shareholders. We'd like them not to pollute the creek, but really the creek pollution thing is something that should be handled by government regulation. And the penalty should be high enough that they don't pollute the creek. That's how the system works. But I think at the end of the day, there seems to be this ever-pressing push towards that. And so I do wonder where that lands, as we start to mechanize, to automate so much of this through AI. I've always joked about this of like the super singularity, like, how long till all the information that we're training LLMs on is produced by previous forms of the LLM? And do we slowly homogenize language till it's one word? Because we just keep reducing the variability until
shrink. I mean, look, we actually found, we ran a test because like I'll talk to you about it at some point, but we have this like product that allows data teams to run like some of these loosey-goosey prompts on top of there. Imagine like adding a column to a Google Excel spreadsheet, and instead of it being a formula, it's like, hey, like make a decision off of the data in column like X. It's just like it like runs an LLM prompt over like a billion rows. And we realized that like you can actually increase the quality of the outputs by writing better prompts. And the people that write prompts better are LLMs. So like our LLMs are writing prompts for other LLMs now, which,
And again, I don't know where all that goes, but to your original point, I do think this concept of AI and generative AI as an amplifier for business is 100% true. And I think that it enables people to think about things that they wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And it also, to your point, enables thought or decisions to be made on sets of data that would be relatively unconsumable by a single person, right? Or the number of people in the chain to produce that, right? You have a whole team of analysts and they're producing a report, which is consumed by mid-level managers who are then producing a set of reports, which is consumed by leadership, and that I think makes a ton of sense. And even if as you start to look at agentic workflow and how that works, and this thought of like very, very focused models on specific use cases, that with an agentic workflow, the ability to kind of check your own work. And there's still a lot of that, especially in the finance space. I think there's a ton of use cases there. Just in general, the concept of systems that are heavily constrained by a RAG makes a ton of sense because that's finance. Finance, you can't be wrong. You need to always be right. So as long as you're really restricting the data it's training from, there's a ton of that I think is valuable. And I think that the hard part we've seen is, especially in the agentic workflow space, there's not a lot of companies doing that. Workato does that. Flowcast does that. They're probably in 12 months, everybody will have agentic workflows you can build and put together. But the problem again is that you're asking buyers to be creative enough in their thought to think to need the problem to solve.
This is something, I think overall, this is the biggest problem with AI in general, is that it requires you to have a level of 0 to 1 thinking and to approach problems with 0 to 1 thinking, which is not a skill a lot of people have. And even if you do nurture that, it's not your default way. And so what we just keep seeing are people who need to be shown a use case and a way to do something. And they're like, oh, that makes total sense. I'll do that all the time. But you have to already plan out what the use cases are for them and show them how to do it, because otherwise we're just writing AI blogs with AI and email copy with AI, because that's what we've seen.
Right. And there's also a presumed level of enthusiasm, right? I think we're all here today because we all like to think about this stuff, but there's a lot of people out there that don't really care. They show up, they want to do their job, they want to make enough money to feed their family and to pay their mortgage or feed their pets or travel or whatever it is they want to do. And their job is a means to an end. It's not the purpose. And I think that's back to your concept, maybe about the productivity, and then always productivity is there's a lot of people don't really care about that. And so that'll be interesting too. I still quote you, UBI baby, from the first time we talked. I think I was talking about the guys from Wall-E floating around in their chairs, but that's the interesting part for me from like a socio-anthropological perspective, is like, what does all this mean for society? How do people, because AI is going to always be enthusiastic. It's always going to want to be faster, right?
What about the people that just love their job, right? Like you talked about accountants being unique creatures. I'm listening to this book, or re-listening to this book, and it's talking about the accountant for this huge company was still using a paper ledger and had red and black ink. And that's not because he's not smart enough to wrap his head around it. He just enjoyed the deliberate process of going through all this, right? And so it's like,
I used to work with a woman who would go get the tax forms, paper tax forms, and write them out by hand because she enjoyed the process.
Yeah, cool. You can make my workflow faster. That's not what I'm here for. Like, I'm doing my job. And now you're asking me to take a job I learned, have done well, and have gotten promoted in love. And you're saying your job is now something completely different because we have figured out how to automate that.
I mean, go back to craftsmen, right? I mean, we're now printing, functionally printing furniture in some factory someplace where we're tearing all the wood up into chunks and gluing it all back together and molding it. And there used to be people that love to do that. And so I don't know what that means. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see the impact over time, to look backwards on this time period and see what the impact is.
Well, that's a great corollary, because like there still are incredible craftsmen making incredible things, and now they get to charge an uber premium.
Yes.
But what are you going to pay quadruple to an accountant because he does it by hand? Like, if anything, you'd be.
Let's take the thing we already identified as a cost center, and I'm going to make it 10 times more expensive because the guy's going to do it by hand.
It's boutique, baby.
I have a thought on this. I'm curious to see what you guys think. I actually think a pretty promotional like thought on it. They're fairly like optimistic view, which is that there's actually like, okay, think back to every single time there's been innovation to this level. Like the one that I always remember is like the invention of the ATM. Like people were like up in arms about the invention of the ATM because they're like, oh, like bank tellers are going to lose their jobs. And like, sorry, people that work at banks, bankers, like there's people who are called bankers in like the 1940s or whatever. Like, no, they're going to lose their jobs. And it's like, no, like a human is worth more. A human life and human talent is worth more than taking stuff out of a machine and handing it to a person.
Yeah, they should get screamed at by upset bank customers. That's what you're saying.
That's called customer service.
So the sort of like biting of the tongue there, super warranted, but like maybe, right? Like maybe like the person that like is best able to handle relationships, right? Like an objective, somebody who's like objective and can like understand, hey, like, can this person like, should this person like, what mortgage rate should they pay? Or like, should we like give them a loan? Like, what do we think of their business? Like that is the kind of stuff that like we should leave to humans. Like I agree. I think that there is going to be like probably some sector of society that is going to be like very damaged negatively by this. That's it. Damaged negatively does not need to be said. But like, I think that what it allows for is it allows us for space to be able to like have innovation, and like the next generation of people have to have maybe slightly like, I think what it does is, I was interviewing a candidate the other day for like a chief of staff position. One of the things that we like talked about was maybe like the next level of software engineer does not need to like know how to like write a for loop, but needs to know how to like just like innovate and think creatively. And we start to value like an English degree more than we value a maths degree.
Right. You don't have to do hand long division anymore. You can run it in the calculators. You know, you can think about the problem you're solving as opposed to solving the problem.
Exactly.
I was to say, you know, I've seen a bunch of things about how many artists and writers come from wealthy families, and even though they may be saying like, I don't need this, I'm an artist, like the fact that you were able to say that I'm going on my own and striking out, you were educated well, you had all these things kind of for you, like, do we really think that, you know, the apex of human development is accounting and marketing and stuff like that? Or is there like a world in which we can pursue passions and this, we don't need this? And like, I get that, like, that's not what's going to happen. We are all going to keep working in some way or another. And, you know, the economy will march on. But in a philosophical way, I do think you're right that there is like a higher calling for everybody to embrace the softer sides, to be philosophical, to be a writer, to be a musically talented and a painter or whatever they want to do.
Yeah, I've thought about this a bit because again, we do a lot in AI and automation, and so often I find and this is kind of my thing, right? As you guys found last time, I read a lot and I think a lot about, you know, human history and, you know, who we are and where we are. And one of the things I keep coming back to, which is interesting to me, is, you know, is this concept of the value of labor. And this goes back to like Nietzsche and Marx. I mean, this goes way back to this concept that labor is the means of transforming raw materials into value, right? So as an owner, if you own a bunch of land with iron ore in it, you need people to come in and help you convert that to iron bars so you can sell them, right? So then the theory goes, well, if we have AI and especially robotic AI, does that change the value of labor? Do we migrate where that value is? Which is interesting, because the answer is probably yes. If I now can hire robots to do that, why do I need people? But then the other side of this is that capitalism is fundamentally based on the concept of exchange of goods, which means somebody has to buy it, right? So if you don't pay people to dig it and to convert it, and you pay AI, then who's buying it? And so that creates an interesting conundrum societally for us to think about. Because I think to your point, Sean, the optimism of this is, well, if we can get this thing to automate, we can all be dancers and philosophers. But you know, the reality is that we all work for companies that are about the exchange of goods, and many of us have worked for private equity or VC investors. Investors are not in the business of giving money away; they're not a nonprofit. And so, you know, that'll be an interesting concept to think about as we go forward.
Extending that thread, one thing a boss pointed out to me when I was an Army officer, and as a lesson I learned very, very deeply, was that the likelihood of one of your soldiers, and so we can say not, just people in general, getting in trouble on a weekend, which as an Army officer, that meant that I was now going in on a weekend to pick them up and, either get them out of jail or deal with whatever, or, you're dealing with disciplinary issues and that ruins everyone's weekend. It increased significantly if we had a easy week, if I let them off early on Friday, all that. And lo and behold, the days where we worked our asses off or we're in the field, and low on sleep and worked super hard, and there were no incidents on weekends. People were relaxing at home and were well behaved and spent time with family. And so I do think there is also an aspect of, even in that theoretically ideal world where we're writers and painters and philosophers, it probably gets kind of dark because people just need a little adventure and fire in their lives.
Well, and back to your point about passion, who are you then? What do you do? Right? If you don't have a job, which for the long section of modern Western human history, we've all had jobs, then who are you? What's your purpose, right? Go back to Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about the folks that survived were the ones who had purpose, right? So yeah, it's an interesting thought exercise. That said, all of that presumes an adoption curve that I don't know what that looks like yet, but we have seen in the most recent survey we did, we have seen a reduction in the enthusiasm of leadership teams and boards around the adoption of AI. Now, it used to be 110%. So there was going to be a reduction because that was right. The level of enthusiasm 12 or 18 months ago was sky high. But I think some of that is because we're getting out of the theoretical space of what is AI and we're starting to see the practicalities of what it does. And people are realizing, hey, this is great, right? Ibby, you gave great examples of the use cases where there's value, but it's not, the imagination is always bigger than the reality. And so it's, we've had automation since the cotton gin and people still work in factories. So, but to your point, Ibby, there's a transferability of labor that's assumed in economics, right? Economics says as an industry dies, another one grows, everyone moves. Well, reality of that is not. People don't, I just posted about this on LinkedIn the other day. Change is hard, right? Organizations are full of people and people don't like change. So it'll be interesting to see where a lot of this, I think, actually gets back to, unfortunately, what we would call a cost center in the guise of this conversation, which is, how do you care for your people? How do you talk about this with your teams when there's this ever-present threat that their job's going to be automated or, given to AI? How do you coach, people over 40 to change, right?
That's the tough one, right? Like that's like there are so many open questions there. So many open questions. Yeah. I hate to end on like a bummer note.
Well, then let's have we have Aidan's book corner, and you can tell us what books I need to be recommending. We need to get Vinny and them to like give us a little inner episode, like design thing and music and intro for Aidan's book corner. Aidan, you're the first person who's come on for a second episode.
I am reading this one currently.
I'm reading that one. Yeah, this was on your reco list last time.
This is on your reco list last time.
I have 5 copies specifically for the purpose of handing out, because I think it's one of the more important. It's back to your point, Sean, about life is meant to be lived, right? The theory in that book that like time didn't become an asset till we invented clocks and put them in factories. Like time used to just be called life. And now we think of time as like an exhaustible asset.
Last time we talked, I was so jazzed up that I went back and I told my wife, I was like, oh my gosh, she recommended this book. I like tried to quote you just the whole time and just parrot back everything you said. And she's like, oh, that sounds a lot like this other book. And so, we had 2 books that sound similar. So we listened to hers, as you would, how these conversations go. And so we're going through the whole thing, and I was like, this is fantastic. I love this. It was called Meditation for Mortals. And at the very end, we find out it was written by the same damn guy. So I'm on 4,000 Weeks now, but I can attest that his other book was also phenomenal. And so I'm super jazzed about that.
So I'm trying to think of what I've read since then. I've read a few fiction books. So I read a book, and this is unrelated to this podcast theme, other than there's a lot of data in it. There's a book called American Nations by Colin Woodard. And what he does is he traces the cultural groups that migrated to the United States. And then he traces those cultures as they spread across the United States. And he creates a map of what he calls the 7 nations of America. So there's Yankees, who were Eastern British, parliamentary, educated, who founded Boston. You've got Tidewater, which is Virginia, which were like cousins of the king. You have the Deep South, which was founded by slave-owning cultures, Dutch Huguenots out of the islands, right? Alexander Hamilton came from that group. Then you've got Borderlands, which is Irish, Scots-Irish, and Scottish. And that's like Western PA down through Texas. Then you've got the Far West, which was really kind of an open area that was really kind of founded by the train companies, because they were stretching the trains across the U.S. They had to give people a reason to get on the train. And so they were building, a lot of towns out there. There was a lot of mining companies. You've got the left coast, which is Washington, Oregon, Northern California. And then you've got the El Norte, which is basically the northern part of Mexico, southern part of the United States. So Southern California, Arizona, parts of Texas, that was heavily influenced by Mexico. And so he traces all of these cultural moves. And then he looks at voting patterns and decision patterns and cultural patterns. And what's crazy is if you take the line, for example, in Ohio between Yankeedom and the Borderlands, which was established about 225 years ago, and you look at voting patterns, runs right along that line.
No way. Wait, why? Did he give you an explanation?
Oh, he gives you a whole explanation.
Oh, that's so cool. Wait, I missed it. What's the book called?
It's called American Nations. I've got a link. We'll put it in the show notes and in the YouTube notes and all that.
Yeah. Now, at the risk of it contains politics, as you might imagine. So at the risk of politicizing your non-political business podcast. But to me, it was fascinating. And I actually think as an American, it's a really important book to read to understand some of the fundamentals of who we are as a country, right? Because he even goes into like the Revolutionary War, and that the Revolutionary War wasn't one war, it was multiple wars for multiple reasons. A great example, one of my favorite anecdotes from the book, is we always think of George Washington as this great revolutionary hero, which he was. However, the reason he got involved originally, because Tidewater was a lot of cousins of the king. They didn't want to really make the king angry because they were friends of the king, and they liked the kind of aristocracy of British monarchy. They had rights, Tidewater, which is Virginia, they had rights over the Appalachians and out into the West for land rights. And at some point they realized that the British were able to establish control, they would lose their land rights. And so Madison and Washington originally got into the Revolutionary War, not because of some sort of serious ideological purity, but because they didn't want to lose the land rights they had. Which is funny, because for me, it makes it fundamentally human. This idea that the founders were all of these ideologues who did this because they saw the future is a great story, and it's a great mythology, but it doesn't track with who we know ourselves to be. Whereas instead, when you say, well, Yankeedom didn't like the Brits because the Brits had a form of Catholicism, the Anglican Church, and they were Protestant, and they didn't want to be the hegemony of, right? They had left the UK to avoid that church, and now they were being forced. So they want to fight the British for religious reasons. Tidewater wants to fight the British because of land reasons. The Deep South wants to fight the British because of slavery reasons. And so once you start to piece this together, it starts to kind of reiterate that the human experience is fundamentally selfish, not in a negative way. I think we all think of selfishness as negative, which in a lot of cases it can be. But living is a selfish experience, right? And so it very much humanizes a lot of America, and it gives you reasons why they are the way they are. I mean, the Borderlands, which is fundamentally Appalachia, is known for a distrust of the federal government. And that goes back to them fighting the Revolutionary War and having IOUs and getting screwed out of the money by Alexander Hamilton's Bank of New York. So he had a bunch of rich buddies who went and bought these IOUs for pennies on the dollar. Then they put taxes out, and one of the things they taxed was corn whiskey that was produced in Appalachia. They took those tax dollars and then they paid their rich buddies 100% of the value of those IOUs. And to this day, Appalachia hates the federal government. I mean, it's a study on human nature. It's a study on kind of socioanthropology. It's a study on migration patterns. And it's a reflection on the United States is the United States. We are a collection of cultures and a collection of people. We are not one nation, right? We're not like a Germany or a France where we have this kind of fundamental cultural uniformity that we've had for thousands of years, right? We're a combination of folks.
We're actually new. We're pretty young, right? Like the bicentennial was in 1976. And so like if the average, I don't know, how many generations is that? Like 8, 7, 6? Like, yeah, people hold grudges for like longer than you think is like maybe a thing.
Even when you think about Europe, right? And it's interesting when you think about the unification of those. I was a history major in college, and that was one of the things we talked about all the time was when new kings would come in or a new empire would start, they had to create some sort of unifying thing because it was an empire fell. Germany, yes, there were people in Germany, but it wasn't the country of Germany for thousands of years, right? It was a various batches of empires. And so that's why like in Italy, they're like, no, I'm Roman. And here I am from Florence. And it's like about where you're from, your name. We actually, this is going back to the episode, we were talking about who are you without your job? Literally so many people are named, their last name is a craft because that's what they did. Your last name, Parisian, like it means Aidan from Paris, right? Like it's wild how this identification changes so much and how much it lasts.
Yeah, it is a really fascinating book. It can be discouraging because it's, especially if you have kind of the idealized version of America, as a whole unit. But, as you can see in our last, 20 years of politics where we don't operate like a whole unit. And if anything, this book helps you understand some of the basis behind that. This isn't a new problem, right? A lot of what we're seeing now is actually a manifestation of divisions that have always been present.
And to make it positive, right? Because I think you're right. You taking down the folklore of our founding fathers and all that could sound depressing. But if you put it more practically, these were 22 to 24-year-old kids, essentially startup founders who had an idea and did stuff, right? And so now to humanize it and say like, hey, maybe they are fallible. Maybe these are ideas, but doesn't that give you more hope for our ability to continue to innovate and make things better? It wasn't that there was just like happened to be one generation in the history of the world with 30 brilliant people that most Americans can name 4 of. They were smart people who worked hard and did stuff and came together and solved problems.
100%. And it's a reminder that we're all human and that if anything, in my mind, maybe this is only my personal opinion, it makes the humanity of it makes them more important, to your point. Because when you realize that they were fractured, broken in all the ways that anybody could be, right? I mean, Alexander Hamilton's a great example. We all know that history because of the Hamilton the musical and kind of the burst of time coming out of the book that was written. For him to accomplish what he did, I mean, we would write articles and articles if he was a founder. This kid grew up poor, didn't know who his dad was or kind of knew who his dad was and, found a guy who liked him enough to give him some cash to send him to the United States to go to college, and he worked his way up. I mean, these are, to your point of, founder, these are the stories we still tell. They just happen to be, at the time, militaristic or political instead of capital.
Boom. I think that's where we end.
I think that's where we end. Aidan, a pleasure as always. And I think you're the first double time.
I look forward to being the first third time.
I think you're the first person bestowed with the name Friend of the Pod. I think that's the title.
A friend of the pod. You are the first friend of the pod.
These are my eagerness to do this was more about the chance to chat with you two than anything else. So we could do this and not record it, and I would spend this time.
I was gonna say, do you have like any plans to come out east? I know you're busy and stuff, but like anything anywhere in near?
Yeah, I got to see how this year goes. But we have an office in New York, so at some point, if I end up out there, I'll let you guys know for sure.
Yeah, we'll take you out for dinner, drinks, both, whatever.
Great.
Thanks as always.